Hello.
Our story begins following the destruction of Jedha City. The attack made by the Death Star left the Rebel Alliance in total fear. With the largest group of rebels gathered up on Yavin 4 to discuss the future of their movement, they needed to determine how they wanted to approach this super station. Former senators of the Old Senate spoke of breaking up and running into the shadows to avoid the Empire. Without Captain Andor and their little band of rebels back on Yavin, there was no one to lift the spirits of the now hopeless rebels. The issue is, their main target was finding Galen Erso, and killing him after forcing his information on the Death Star's weakness from his lips. But they couldn't just do that now. Of course, Andor was leading his mission to Edu so that he could kill Galen at the apparent Kyber refinery that was sending power to the superweapon. Though the main group of rebels gathered on Yavin needed an objective. Having seen a small fraction of the power the weapon held was enough to send fear through every heart. But at the center of that fear was a rage. The rebels had been beaten down and abused. From the early days of their movement to the now, they had spent 19 years battling the oppressive force. And even though leaders of the Alliance were ready to cower in fear, the heart of the rebel movement was in rebelling. Something about seeing Jedha get detonated put an unresolvable desire into their minds and into their hearts. The Empire just showed that they would stop at nothing to ensure they had total domineering control over the galaxy. If it meant destroying the entire city to get a single pilot, then they would. Imagine what they would do for any other minor inconvenience. They wouldn't stop, and this test was proof that the Imperial machine would continue to innovate in the art of oppression. If they hid away from the fight on their doorstep, then they were damning the galaxy to another Death Star, or something far worse. Complacency breeds evil, and the galaxy now had to warily watch the moves of the Empire. With the Senate being dismissed by the Emperor in the coming session, the people of the galaxy tried to reason with Jedha's explanation. Apparently, it was a mining incident, according to Imperial officials, but everyone could feel that something was off. Even die-hard Imperial loyalists knew that there was a lie brewing in the air, and whether they supported the innovation of Imperial militaristic operations, it didn't matter. Everyone knew something happened at Jedha, and it wasn't accidental. Therefore, on Yavin, the rebel fighters were eager to make a move for the superweapon. Luckily for them, there was news from a rebel ally who had got to Jedha before the Death Star abandoned the system. Former ISB agent Alexander Callus was in the area and took a risk upon himself, knowing that the best way to move forward was by stopping the station. He, using the debris as cover, snuck into one of the many Death Star hangar bays and used his spy code to inform the rebels of his given coordinates. This was a huge risk on his part. Callus was completely alone on this mission, also looking for Saul Guerrero before Cassian was assigned to find him with Jyn Erso. After not having found Saul on Jedha, he moved to neighboring systems, which is how he avoided dying on the planet. So, as in the hope that the rebels would be motivated by the sheer audacity of the Imperial machine, he infiltrated their lines, parking his ship in a hangar bay and killing a few stormtroopers so that he could blend in by wearing their armor. The rebels on Yavin had to make a choice. They could strike at the Death Star and catch it off guard, but they were reliant on Callus to help them get into the facility. He, while inside the facility, captured 2 Imperial astromechs and 4 mouse droids. Using some tools he found in their supply bay, he reconfigured the droids to work on behalf of the Alliance. The astromechs would assist in taking down some key defense systems of the Death Star, while the mouse droids blocked off reinforcement garrisons. He just hoped that the rebels had the courage to finish this fight the way they needed to. As Blue Squadron was dispatched from Yavin to assist Cassian at Edu, the famously popular Admiral Raddus made a judgment call. The Mon Cala rebel admiral was a trooper's leader. He worked really well with maintaining a high morale, because he cared about the effectiveness of his soldiers' mental health, before their own physical health. Raddus kept his men in line with focus, but he also ensured they were motivated every time he spoke to them. So while Mon Mothma and Bail Organa dragged their feet on a decision, Raddus riled his troopers up and encouraged the entirety of the rebels on Yavin to join him. He was going to hunt down this Death Star and take it with force. It was a silly idea, admittedly, but there was absolutely no certainty that Cassian would find the Death Star plans, or come up with any method to stop it. So they needed to put their best foot forward and attack. The good thing is, because Raddus was calling the shots, 98% of the rebel troopers on Yavin were ready to go with him. Again, they had no clue where the reactor shaft was, so they were going in completely blind. But there was yet another benefit. As Raddus was making his moves, he sent out a signal to other rebels across the galaxy, encouraging them to join. This alerted rebel cells and bases across the stars, from Crate, Azhin Claws, Dakar, Beorora, Hope Station, and Horrocks 3. These rebels got up in arms and were ready to fight. There was a key difference in morale following Jedha. If it were a full planet, like say Alderaan, these people wouldn't be as motivated. The planet was devastated, sure, but watching a system like Alderaan get destroyed would have sent fear through the ranks of the Alliance, even encouraging different rebels to step out of the fight and surrender. This is something Admiral Raddus knew, which is why he was especially ready to get into the Death Star and conquer it inside with force. They might be able to even use Imperial officers within the facility as bargaining tools. So as the rebels dispersed from their bases, they moved on the Death Star, currently sitting in neutral space, after obliterating Jedha and hiding from any connection to the mining incident. It would take hours, but Imperial personnel on the station would be in for a very pleasant surprise. The Rebel fleet that dropped out of hyperspace was the largest showing of Rebel forces since the defense at Atalan. Admiral Raddus was completely prepared, and despite Alliance leaders trying to rally their troops back to their bases, Raddus had one thing none of those leaders had, which was true battle experience. He was able to motivate his troopers by being a warrior, not a figurehead or a talking person. So as the fleet moved on the Death Star, dozens of other vessels, large and small, exited from hyperspace around the profundity. Inside the superstation, Imperials panicked. They ran for their gunning positions as TIE fighters exited from their hangar bays. Raddus sent in the first wave of Rebel fighters, following behind Red Squadron. The attack was vicious, but very quickly did the Imperials find that they couldn't just maintain control over this fight with the turbo cannons on the station. All of their weapons were jammed, some so badly that they imploded, killing entire crews of gunners. The rebels continued to push forward, with Raddus calling upon boarding parties to prepare their weapons. Though something even surprised the admiral of the rebel fleet, which was the arrival of the Tantive 4. Princess Leia Organa was prepared for battle, and she brought volunteers from Alderaan to join this fight. She knew that Admiral Raddus would do everything within his power to make sure the rebels were inspired, so why not be a part of that? If royalty could fight and stand their ground, then surely anyone else could. What made this assault 100 times easier was the work Agent Callus did inside the facility. While he wasn't a total tech wizard, the astromechs and mouse droids did a whole lot of extra work for him. Imperial stormtroopers were constantly getting cut off from decks where cannons were functional, and the astromechs were doing overtime to make sure the weapons didn't come back online. Tarkin, who was in the middle of another board meeting, attempted to get to the command center, but he was also getting blocked off. This was done by Callus. In the meantime, rebel gunships and landing craft reached neighboring hangar bays, and out from them rushed starving rebel fighters, fighting for Jedha. They were desperate for a fight, and even more so for a victory. The hangar bays quickly erupted into blaster fire. Inside one of the many hangar bays, General Syndulla joined Zeb, Rex, Wolf, and a few other heroes from the Fallen. Another hangar bay had Princess Leia Organa, firing into the ranks of stormtroopers, following behind the Alderaanian Guard. In space, just outside of the hangar bays, were the pilots of the rebel squadrons. They were tearing through Imperial TIE fighters, while Admiral Raddus joined the last transport from the profundity of troops to the Death Star. Per his orders, the main fleet operators, or people that weren't good on ground combat, were to take the fleet and return to Yavin. They were essentially trapping themselves on the superweapon, but the rebel fleet wouldn't be able to stay safe forever if they stayed outside of the Death Star, so Raddus was joining his troopers inside the station to rally them. As he landed inside the main hangar bay, he fired his pistol at the stormtroopers, who gathered up. Their ranks were crumbling and morale was starting to shrink. Outside, the rebel fleet, aside from the fighters, turned around and departed into hyperspace, giving the astromechs working on behalf of the rebels the chance to focus on other tasks, per Callus's instructions. Every single group of Y-Wings, A-Wings, and X-Wings sped towards various bays on the same side of the superweapon and landed, getting out and using their stored weapons to kill whatever security was inside of the given bay. Every rebel knew that they couldn't effectively kill every stormtrooper inside the base, but they had to be vigilant in their assault. They were simply capturing the station. With 3 figureheads leading the charge, the rebel fighters were inspired to fight better. Leia, Hera, and Raddus were everything the Alliance needed in this fight, and so, as they were pressing into the various corridors inside the superstation, Agent Callus made a beeline for Tarkin's position. He was going to slaughter the guards present and trap them inside the boardroom. While things were looking quite peachy for the rebels inside the Death Star, because of the diversions ran by the droid forces, there was an issue, which was the Imperial fleet that was alerted to this. Lord Vader's Devastator was also being redirected towards this location, and at the same time a much larger fleet from the core was being dispatched. The Emperor refused to lose such a powerful asset. He was so excited about the show at Jedha that he commissioned a second Death Star to be built at Endor, hoping that the specs from the first one could be used to enlarge it and even produce it faster. But the first one was in peril, and a massive fleet was deployed to save it. The rebels inside the base knew they had very little time until the Death Star was attacked by an Imperial fleet. The issue they had was the fact that the facility was so large, though there was some benefits to that. Imperials had been harboring slaves of the Empire and prisoners of war inside the facility. Some of them were used for actual construction on the base, but all of these people would fight against the Empire if given the chance to be freed. So the rebels had 2 main objectives: secure the control room and free the prisoners. In the meantime, Chopper and R2-D2 in 2 completely different corridors of the facility were running a mess of the Death Star's technical side. Their chaotic knob twists created a more stable route for the rebels, which made their path to the detention center a lot easier. The rebels weren't winning in training, because despite the reputation of Imperial stormtroopers, this was an interior fight. They were firing down corridors, and it was pretty hard to constantly miss. So the rebels had to be careful of their numbers because they didn't have seemingly infinite reinforcements or plot armor. Though this led to R2 and Chopper to have a kill count competition, because if the rebels couldn't effectively kill off every Imperial trooper, you know what could? The cold reaches of space. Airlocks were opened across the facility. A couple systems were overblown and detonated, sucking people out into space. It was truly a chaotic mess for the stormtroopers, until someone got inside the command center and got the bright idea to stop anyone from messing with the astromech ports, which electrocuted the 4 Alliance droids that were using them. The mouse droids were unaffected by this technological counter, so they were able to continue stopping Imperial troopers from cornering and executing the rebel forces. Across the base, Admiral Raddus and General Syndulla united. Their groups were pushing heavily, and with their leaders literally leading the charge, they had their shot for the control room. It was in a mission like this that Hera really missed having Jedi around. They made this type of thing a lot easier. Regardless, they were able to plant explosives on the control center door and blow it open. The rebels poured into the facility, capturing the personnel and forcing them to surrender. With control over the actual station, Chopper was able to reconfigure the gunning positions and release the block on the astromech port, allowing R2 and the other droids to work seamlessly. Despite breaking into the command center, Tarkin was nowhere to be seen. He was actually being lectured by former Agent Callus, because he had a couple select words for one of his former employers. Tarkin rolled his eyes at it, but he also couldn't do anything to escape it. In the meantime, Leia and her unit pushed into the detention center. A bright Imperial officer knew that the rebels would make a move, so they loaded the entire center up with troopers. However, that wouldn't work in their favor. Leia's group divided up, making them even weaker overall, but allowing them to blindside the Imperials who assumed she'd come in from the main entrance exclusively. Leia knew that taking the elevator into the detention center was a bad idea, so the first elevator down had a bag full of explosives, and they were lobbed out of the elevator by a brave volunteer who did die in the process. But they destroyed the control console, killed off about 24 troopers, and set every single prisoner inside the detention area free. So when the rebels started firing into different corridors, people who were enslaved by the Imperial regime broke free and started tearing away at their captors. They fought for E-11s and stole them from dead troopers before using them against the same stormtroopers. Without even thanking Leia, they got in line and started working with the Princess of Alderaan. While thousands of stormtroopers chaotically looked for a stronghold inside the base, which they were able to form, the rebels moved into gunner positions. From Kuat came one of the largest Imperial fleets. It was outfitted with regular destroyers, but also a couple of the newly constructed Allegiance-class destroyers and 2 Titan-class battleships. These were precursors to the Superstar Dreadnought program that was in the works. Again, the Imperial machine created counters for something the Alliance didn't have, which was a fleet. So this Imperial unit arrived to destroy Raddus's fleet, but that wasn't present. Instead, the base, the Death Star, was completely shielded. The Admiral of the Imperial force prepared to raid the Imperial project. The truth is, the Imperial officer in charge of this force hadn't ever heard of the Death Star before, so he believed he held command over the largest force in the Empire, only to see this massive space station. He prepared ground troops, not wanting to damage the Emperor's prized possession. Palpatine had dispatched this fleet before he disbanded the Imperial Senate. His hopes were that once he was finished, the station would be in their hands once more. With Vader speeding towards the site of the conflict, that reality was more likely than not. As Imperial gunships sped towards the superstation, rebels in the command deck, under the command of Admiral Raddus, started firing away with the turbo lasers on the ship. Imperial gunships were forced to avoid heavy flak, but with the aid of some more hijacked astromechs inside the Death Star, surface cannons were able to crush through these Imperial transports. With a clear path from the command center to one of the rebel-occupied hangar bays, a few starfighters, following the Ghost, were able to also intercept these gunships. This left the Empire losing nearly 300 soldiers in the first few minutes of their assault, and as a result, they sent TIE fighters to stop the rebels. But Syndulla wasn't going to give the Empire a chance, so they returned to the cover of the hangar bays, as blaster fire filled the space between the Death Star and the Imperial fleet. The skirmish would continue for another hour, with thousands of troopers being sacrificed and only a couple of gunships finding home inside of a hangar bay, before all the stormtroopers were killed by rebel guardsmen. The facility was holding strong, and with more prisoners ferrying into the control room, and more Imperial personnel getting targeted by rebel attacks inside the base, it was impossible to get a hold for the Empire. By the time Vader's destroyer arrived, the rebels figured out how to lock down the hangar bays, though they didn't manually close the hangar bays. The space station had a semi-experimental technology on it, something done by one of the engineers in Galen Erso's squad. They created a ray-shielded hangar bay. Essentially, instead of flying through the shield, you'd hit it and die. It was meant to protect the station from attacks like this, but the officer on deck wasn't aware of it when the rebels attacked earlier, because they were completely unprepared for a rebel attack so quickly. Also, that Imperial officer arrogantly thought that TIE fighters and surface cannons would deter the rebels. When the fighters were destroyed and the surface cannons malfunctioned, that was clearly not the case. The standoff with Vader nearly concluded in him obliterating himself on the ray shields, before ordering the Imperial fleet to fire on the rebel station. Most of the damage done during the siege was on Imperial gunships. The turbo lasers on the Death Star hadn't been ordered to fire at the Star Destroyers, and the rebels were trying to incur as many Imperial kills as they could before the Empire retreated. They assumed that the Admiral would continue sending reinforcements until they ran out, because the Emperor wouldn't want the station damaged. They were right, until Vader showed up, because he had absolutely no regard for this technological terror. Once the turbo lasers on the Imperial fleet opened fire, Admiral Raddus reacted with strength. He had placed one of his many captains in command of the control center, while he learned more about the superstation they had control over, and he learned that the actual weapon could be used multiple times if used on a smaller target. The reload time wasn't too terrible for a single reactor ignition, so Raddus prepared to do just that. Aside from Vader, no one in the fleet was aware of what the Death Star had done to Jedha, because it was just a mining incident. So when the first green blast fired, men of the Imperial military, inside and outside the Death Star, watched in awe and in terror. Luckily, Vader was flying in his starfighter, so he was looking for a route into the facility. But he also watched one of the battleships explode into a bright array of fire. It lit the dark sky, and as more turbo lasers fired from both the Death Star and the Imperial fleet, he realized that the victor had already been determined. Vader got into contact with the Admiral of the fleet, before another single ignition blast came from the Death Star, eliminating the only other Titan battleship in the fleet and killing the Admiral. The captains of the various vessels were sent into a panic, as Vader tried to rally them together, but it didn't really work. See, for the Imperials who never saw the green blast, it was an ungodly experience, and their terror left them in a state of confusion. Destroyers sped into different directions, unloading broadsides at the shields of the impenetrable space station. Another blast fired away and detonated a ship next to Vader, nearly killing him in another blast. Inside the command center, the rebels were having a ton of fun. Raddus was also forced to gather a group of rebel fighters to slaughter incoming troopers in the corridors. But by the time they finished holding off the bridge, the Imperial fleet had departed into hyperspace, abandoning Vader in the wreckage field. The rebels didn't care about him, but they also did surprise him because they didn't know he was there. As he was floating through the wreckage trying to find a route out of the system, he was surprised by a wing of rebels behind General Syndulla, which damaged his hyperdrive. They weren't hunting him per se, just looking for survivors, which is why they fired at his vessel. He escaped death, but he was now trapped, and too far out of communication to reach reinforcements. So, without a hyperdrive, he'd be abandoned once the Death Star left the location. While Cassian Andor and the rest of makeshift Rogue One were escaping from Edo and returning to Yavin 4, the Alliance had to make a judgment call. Thanks to Syndulla, Raddus, and Organa, the rebels had complete control over the Death Star. Those who still served inside the space station were given the chance to join the Alliance or be put into prison. Sadly, there weren't enough cells for every Imperial individual, so they had to double up, and luckily there were plenty of resisting troopers who had to be dealt with for their aggressiveness, so it made the detention center a little easier to fill up. The Death Star would take weeks to fully become clear of Imperial resistance on the inside, but in the meantime, Rebel leadership decided on making the Death Star their primary base of operations, and with Mon Mothma joining the rebellion inside the superstation, she used recorded footage of Jedha as proof that the Imperials were much more interested in internal bickering than they were with the protection of their citizens. She played off, live, the destruction of Jedha City, and the argument that transpired between Krennic and Tarkin following it. While Krennic was on Scarif searching for Stardust, something he would never find, the Empire was trying to make an appropriate decision based on Mon Mothma's live broadcast. The issue strategists had was the fact that the rebels wouldn't hit any planets with the Death Star. There were individuals who wanted to within their ranks, absolutely, but leadership would not allow it. So the biggest threat was the fact that the rebels had a space station that could destroy anything. Though Palpatine realized that he could take advantage of a critical weakness for the rebellion. They didn't have the supplies to maintain the Kyber crystal powering the station. Sure, they devastated the Kuat defense fleet, which was huge as it was, but that crystal inside of it at the moment wouldn't be able to defend them forever. Furthermore, if they had to damage the weapon to take it back, then that was a necessary sacrifice in Palpatine's mind. The only issue now was finding where the rebels went with it, because their location was completely unknown now. The Alliance during the strategy meetings between Imperial officers brought in forces from all across the galaxy, because the Death Star could hold every single rebel in their movement. It had the facilities, the rooms, munitions, supplies, and so forth for the entire Rebel Alliance, and something even greater happened. There was a call to action because of their display of the Empire's cruelness. Showing off on a galactic broadcast the power of the Death Star and Jedha, Krennic and Tarkin's argument, and how the rebels responded was inspiring. Mon Mothma and Bail Organa put together a long speech that was put over top video recordings of the destruction of Jedha and the defeat of the Kuat defense fleet. The two different realities that faced the galaxy. Imperial rule would result in the total destruction of planets as was being reported by Jedha's planetary collapse following the blast. Or it would result in freedom from a group of well-known insurgents with a weapon that could do the same thing, but they didn't use it. The funny thing is, the insurgents sounded like the better option, because it did, at this point, look like they were simply acting in an effort to defend the people of the galaxy from the Empire. The galaxy would wait silently, watching the tension that now filled Imperial ranks. Stormtroopers were sent to outposts, fleets were deployed, and the hunt for the missing weapon began. But as a result of the hypermilitarization of the Imperial machine, protests started to erupt. People were unhappy with the current status of the galaxy. First Jedha, then the Senate, now essentially martial law. It all started with something small and built up. Now people in the core were feeling it. This wasn't nearly as galvanizing as the destruction of Alderaan would have been. But there was also a different sense of revolution that came with the capture of the Death Star. The fight for revolution following the Alliance's control over the superstation helped show people that even if the Empire created a moon-sized weapon, It was a show of how hollow they were as a government. The Imperial machine had great power, but if a few bands of rebels that had been identified by propaganda as lowlifes could take over that superweapon, then what was all their taxes going towards? Surely it wasn't just the shiny armor, because this was pathetic, and with the Empire looking weaker than ever before, people erupted. The next several months would have Imperial personnel searching the galaxy for signs of the Death Star, but never finding it. A moon just disappearing off the map. Thanks to Rebel pilots and Hera Syndulla returning full-time after the birth of her son Jason, strike forces deployed into hot zones across the galaxy. With more materials to use, the Rebels started upgrading TIE fighters inside of the hangar bays of the Death Star. Some of this tech would be comparable to First Order enhancements. The TIEs were given shielding, hyperdrives, and even additional turret seating. The reason for this was because the Rebels liked using the TIE fighters for their speed. X-Wings were phenomenal fighters, but the Alliance was going for quicker, more aggressive assaults, and using Imperial tech helped them get past turbo lasers initially before committing to their assaults. TIE fighters were imperative to Rebel attacks because they were nimble and made it easier to cover their own tracks. This only encouraged more people to join their cause anyways. Though the largest challenge for the Rebels was making sure their new facility had all the materials for its inhabitants. The Death Star was prepared to crew over 1 million people, and much less than 1 million people were on board, including the Imperial prisoners. So they were making sure that the prisoners got food, exercise, and anything else they might need, as well as, of course, the people that were serving on behalf of the Alliance. The main purpose for taking care of the prisoners was to ensure they remained dormant, which mostly worked. Resupplying was the biggest struggle for the Rebels, but with Imperial supply depots across the outer edge of the galaxy where the Death Star was hiding at, the Rebels were able to get kyber crystals, food, more materials for their hangar bay experiments, and so forth. Something that radically changed, especially without Alderaan's collapse, was Imperial morale. Most troopers were unaware of Thrawn's desire to build the TIE Defender, so they just saw the Imperial machine churn out larger projects. Director Krennic was a Moff and working beside Palpatine, but again, they kept trying to go bigger, as seen by work on the second Death Star at Endor. Therein was the problem. The Rebels didn't care about scale, because the fire in their hearts could not be dwarfed by mere technology. It was inspiring, and due to no Alderaan incident taking place, the Imperials pressed harder on the populace because they were rebelling. So in a matter of months, the rebellion had vanished from the public eye with a moon, and were still making successful raids, while the Empire punished citizens for something that didn't involve them. It was beyond the breaking point, and all it took were Rebel sympathizers to light the next flame. Also, after about a month of trying to get home, Vader found his way back to Palpatine, who was very pissed off. The explosion that rocked the Empire came with a surprise attack from the Rebellion. With resistance movements sprouting up across the galaxy, Imperial strategists believed that the Rebels would make their strikes with population groups, or use their protesters as shields for their fight. But no, they brought the Death Star all the way out of hell and dropped it in front of Kuat, with a fully supplied reactor, and the superweapon would fire blast after blast at Imperial warships that were flung into action. The poor officers, they were just having their morning caffeine when a moon dropped out of hyperspace. They were defenseless against it, and even with the full power at Kuat, the superweapon could not be breached. The Rebels used this assault to shred another system fleet of the Empire, which replaced the one they previously destroyed. And the best part is, they were building up a legitimate Rebel fleet over Yavin, but they had no use for it. The fleet now was led by Admiral Akbar, while Raddus maintained control over the Death Star. But aside from that, the long siege at Kuat would completely upend Imperial support for their own military. It was clear they weren't prepared to fend off the Alliance. The irony is, the Rebels showed tons of mercy at the Battle of Kuat. Aside from the fact that they didn't deploy a single wave of fighters, let alone a single fighter, they gave the Imperials a chance to surrender. They didn't fire at the planet or destroy the space station, because the Kuat drive yards were important for commerce. They killed off militaristic threats that fired at them and eventually left the planet, but didn't harm anyone unnecessary. Though the worst part about the attack at Kuat wasn't the actual destruction of another fleet. It was the discovery of another Death Star. Palpatine saw the Rebels take one, so he figured, why not build them a second? Instead of capturing the second weapon, The rebels would deploy Admiral Ackbar and detonate the structure. It had only been months, so most of the present structure was scaffolding, and yes, the crews that were working on it were given a chance to surrender, which most of them did. These Imperials would be returned to their homes and left to survive. A big piece of the Alliance fight was just showing mercy. They learned that, after Jedha especially, they had to be better than the Empire morally, and so that's what they did. They avoided massive conflicts and just stayed in their lanes, waiting for the Empire to make another mistake, one that they could capitalize off of. So Kuat, Jedha, and Endor were great propaganda for the Alliance. And thus, the next 2 years would begin with the defeat at Kuat. The Empire slowly turned in on itself. The attack at the drive yards completely derailed any attempt to stop the Alliance, and with the second superstation being destroyed, it left a power gap in the military complex. Officers were starting to become tired of Palpatine's ways, and saw him as a threat to Imperial longevity. So Mon Mothma sent another broadcast, proclaiming that the New Republic, which was situated inside of Stardust, would be welcoming secessionists of the Empire, believing that their fight against the regime could be more unifying than built-in war. Stardust was not related to Galen Erso whatsoever. They just thought it'd be a cool callback to Starlight Beacon because both were large space stations. No one really caught it, but it pleased Organa and Mothma, so who cares? The 2 years then slowly turned into a divide within Imperial ranks. Due to the continuous failures of the Imperial military, officers believed that they could do better, but they realistically couldn't. The Death Star remained a dormant machine, one that activated whenever the New Republic wanted to make a show of force, but they rarely did that anyways. There were opportunities for the Empire to make a return, but the truth is, the martial law they imposed on the galaxy, as well as the market collapse that followed, would turn people into anti-Imperials. Slowly but surely, planets would secede from the Empire, joining the New Republic, and gaining genuine protection without martial law. Rogue One, the Rebels' rebels, would be imperative for ensuring security for the formerly Imperial territories. Funnily, the Empire had real chances at striking at the New Republic, because they would hold diplomatic meetings inside the superstation itself. But the Imperial Civil War stopped that from happening. Even worse, Vader tried for a spot at the role of Emperor, and got shredded by Sidious, though his son, Luke, would be an important piece of the Outer Rim resistance to join the New Republic. The fledgling power of the New Republic didn't have the resources to fund real wars against the Outer Rim, because at this point, the rebels serving the Republic were serving to defeat the Empire, not Jabba the Hutt. But there were some volunteers that were willing to contribute to these attacks, which helped bring new warriors and planets into their cause. The continuous problem for Palpatine's side of the Civil War was finding the Death Star. The superstation never stayed at one planet, unless it was attacking, like what it did with Kuat. So it just floated around in dead space near no systems, and diplomats were carefully monitored so that they didn't reveal the position of the station. When the 2 years came to a conclusion, Sidious had disappeared and Imperial rivals helped the Republic track down his movement into the unknown regions. The New Republic had a navy that could be used, and because it involved Palpatine, not some scum of the Outer Rim, hundreds of thousands of volunteers lined up for their shot at the Sith Lord. It would be the only true fleet-to-fleet engagement in the entire galactic civil war since the Talon. Admiral Ackbar had been patient, and he finally got to take a bite out of Palpatine, but crushing his fleet of 2 superstar dreadnoughts and the entire support fleet with it. It would be one of the most impressive assaults in galactic naval history, something that would live with Ackbar for the rest of his life. The result of Stardust, heralding in the era of New Republic, was what it did for the military complex. With Bail Organa serving on the Senate and eventually becoming Chancellor, following Mothma's terms, the government was able to maintain the superweapon. It wasn't a choice, but they made adjustments to retrofit it into a more suitable station for the people, rather than just a military base. Those imprisoned on the weapon were free to go, and it would undergo several series of improvements to build it around community. Stardust would become the voice of the galaxy. While it would forever be remembered as a rebel base, it would also be the gift to the galaxy. With brother and sister reuniting under Bail Organa's help, and the New Republic establishing itself firmly in the aftermath of a total and complete Imperial collapse, they had a real shot at fully returning the galaxy to a new Republic. And that, my friends, is our story. Again, special thanks to the patrons:
Manuel Wells, Ozpin, Angel Dust, Alexandra Reese, the beginning and end, Jack Silver, Prismatic Warlock Master, Lyndall Asher, Smoobs, There Are Cars, Darth Vitiate, Seju Jagger, Groot 36, Hunter Belden, Rosebird, General Alexander, Robin Roberts, Blackie Chan, Django Fett Clone, Nick 5098, Ben Ingram, The Big Red Pyramark, Diamond Constant, Darth Nemesis, Lord Tibbs, CC2024, Galvin Gaming, Tristan, Mandalore, Sir William 1767, Darth Revan, Grandaddy Bane, Laliant, Sky Guy, Penguin, Cullen Rooney, Shark Midori, RJ38, Nick, Michael Erlanger, The Last Jedi, Apollo Weewo 670, Annika Stink Runner, CT7567, Toaster Oven, Oz of Oz, Darth Knox, The Eternal Padawan, Joshua Tem, Johnny DeGuin, Sansa Skeleton, Jedi Sloth, Mr. Yeet Gamer, Lord Calic, Youngling Slayer 66, Man Studios, Anakin003, Lord Draken, Ford's Legacy Star Wars, Erebus, Rex the Wolf, The Man of Three First Names, Darkseid 46, Baron Joshua, and Lord Deadwing.
Or support the channel, smash that like button. Let's talk about this story. The attack on the Death Star. This was a story that I knew had to come before Scarif. If this happened after Scarif, I don't think it would work as well. Honestly, you could spend probably an hour on the entire invasion of the Death Star. I think it would be a very hard thing for the rebels to capture. I really wanted to use Callus as like the stepping stone for the rebellion to get into it. I thought that'd be a cool kind of callback because he's former Imperial, all that stuff. So that was kind of like really fun for me, but also having like Admiral Raddus, Leia, and Hera on the front lines of this invasion, I thought would be necessary. But I also made a reference to the 501st Journal mission from the original Battlefront 2, where the rebels were trying to break out of the Death Star. And so that was the reference inside of the story for the rebels going to the detention center. More or less, I wanted this story to focus on the large-scale conflict instead of the more intimate bonds in the fight. I usually do a lot more intimate stuff with characters and characters leading the way. This story was more so designed to be a more militaristic battle map type of thing, and I love the idea of the Death Star kind of just eluding the Empire because it's such a big station, just like a moon that just drops out of hyperspace, destroys a fleet, and it vanishes. It's kind of funny, but anyways, I hope you all enjoyed. I love you all, spread the love, and always, my friends, may the Force be with you.